Okay, hello everyone. It's Maureen from the Embryology Lab here in Syracuse. It is a very cold day today in Syracuse. I woke up, it was 0 degrees outside, so I hope it's a little bit warmer wherever you are, but we are known for our winter weather around here. You might get to experience it if you visit. Hi, Amber. So today I'm sitting in the office across the hallway from the embryology lab. So behind me through that way, through the glass, you can see one of our microscopes, our computer stations at the lab in the background there. I thought you guys might like to see that. Okay, it looks like people are joining in. Awesome. Okay, so today I thought my topic would be embryo transfers. I like to try to break down some of the mystery around what we do in the lab. So today's subject is going to be embryo transfers, but I can see your comments and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. So feel free to just plug those in there as well. Okay, so one thing I wanted to touch on was fresh transfers versus frozen embryo transfers. So your clinical team, -15, your clinical team will decide with you whether you're doing a fresh transfer when you do your egg retrieval, or if we are freezing the embryos and having you come back in another cycle in order to do a frozen embryo transfer. And it used to be when IVF first started that we really preferred fresh transfers, and that was because the technology that we used to freeze and thaw the embryos was not as good as it is today. So today, and for about the last 10 years here at CNY, we use a process called vitrification. Big long word. It comes from the Latin word vitrum. I don't know if I said that right, which means glass. So instead of actually freezing the embryos, which can create ice crystals, which would then damage the embryos, we're actually turning it into a glass-like state. So it's kind of mind-blowing what we do, but we're putting the embryos through a series of solutions that dehydrates the embryo and protects it from the cryopreservation process. And then we plunge the embryo into liquid nitrogen, which is negative 196 degrees Celsius. And let me see, I wrote down, which is negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit. So doing that very quickly, we're bypassing the freezing step, which could actually damage the embryos if any water in there turned to ice. So that is why with this new technology, we have a very high survival rate for embryos. So for your frozen embryo transfer, we get asked a lot, what's the likelihood that my embryo won't survive the thaw? And for 2021, here in Syracuse, our thaw survival rate for embryos was 98.5%. So every once in a while, something may occur where your embryo doesn't survive, but most of the time it's going to be just fine. And doing a frozen embryo transfer allows you to have your lining monitored and your blood work monitored and make sure that all the levels are acceptable and you have a nice comfy environment for the embryo to be transferred into. So don't worry if you have to do a frozen embryo transfer, you should be just fine. And all of our centers are right about at that 98-99% mark for thaw survival for last year. So across the board, we all use vitrification protocols. So any CNY center, you'll be getting that technology. Okay. Let me see. If you are having embryos sent to us that are from another IVF center, occasionally they will use a different thaw and freezing protocol than we do. We are very familiar with most of the methods that are out there, but we may need to order a special thaw kit. So we might have to order media, and that might be an additional cost for you. So other centers might use different, it's still vitrification almost all the time, but they might use a different brand of media or a different device that they freeze the embryos on. So I do have a cryolock. I showed this once before, but this is actually what your embryos are frozen on. It's this very thin straw. We print a tiny little label that wraps around that has your name, date of birth, your CNY ID, the date that we're doing the freezing, and the grade of your embryo, so we can specifically identify each embryo. And then there's a little cap, and this end part is kind of flexible. You can kind of see the black dot. We deposit the embryo close to the black dot, and then we plunge it into liquid nitrogen and swirl it all around. So other centers might use different devices, but we do have a lot of experience because we do get so many embryos from other centers. Okay. So I can glance at some of these questions real quick. So can my fiance send his sperm sample through the mail to the clinic before I start my IVF cycle? Yes, you can do that. So if your partner for whatever reason can't be here for your day of retrieval, he can freeze a sperm sample at another CNY location, or there may be a lab near him, and the travel team could help you with this, where they would send an order to another place and they would freeze the sperm sample, and then it would be shipped to us. We want to make sure it's a good sample though before you start your IVF cycle. Can we do, I'm gonna see if I can get these to show up on the screen. Okay, there we go. Can we do PGT testing post freezing the embryos to check if the embryos are good? So yes, you can thaw your embryos, biopsy them, and refreeze the embryos. It is an additional stress on the embryos, and it depends on the quality of the embryos that you do have. We do this quite often. There is an additional fee for the thaw, biopsy, refreeze, and then there's going to be the costs from Cooper Genomics as well. That's the lab that actually does the DNA testing. Like I said, there is a little bit of stress put on the embryo to be thawed, frozen, and then thawed again for your transfer, but we do have high survival rates. I'd say the riskiest part is if the embryo doesn't re-expand enough or it doesn't have enough cells for us to safely biopsy the embryo. That can happen. In terms of what's more effective, a fresh transfer or a frozen, they're virtually equivalent at this point for our clinic. Each clinic statistics are going to be a little bit different, but it's definitely something to talk to with your doctor or nurse about what might be best for you. But we do a ton of fresh transfers and a ton of frozen transfers, and we have success with both. So I wouldn't worry too much. All right, let me see. Okay, so Elizabeth, this is an interesting question. Can you tell us about the thought process and the cell loss during that period and what you consider a failure percentage of cell loss? So we don't have an exact number of degeneration that we would consider it a failure. We treat each embryo on a case-by-case basis. We don't usually have instances where just some of the embryo doesn't survive and some of it does. If we do, we'll usually discuss it with a physician and see if they want to talk to the patient about thawing another embryo and possibly transferring both embryos or just the one. It really depends on each patient, how many embryos they have, and if we do have degeneration, it's generally the entire embryo. So it either survives or it doesn't, if that helps. Okay, this is a good question about ASRM guidelines for number of embryos to transfer. So we follow ASRM guidelines, which give us a guideline for how many embryos for you to transfer based on your age, the quality of embryos, and the stage of embryo development. So day 3 cleavage stage embryos versus blastocyst embryos, which are days 5, 6, and 7. And in general, if you are 35 or younger, we really recommend transferring 1 embryo because your risk of having a pregnancy with multiples is greatly increased. So even if you transfer 1 embryo when you're under 35, there's there's always a chance, but especially if you're younger, that one embryo can split into twins. So if you transfer 2 or 3 embryos and you have a few of them split into twins, you could end up with a high-risk pregnancy. So we really like to do one at a time when you're younger, and then no matter how old you are, if you have a euploid embryo, meaning that you did PGT testing and the embryo came back as euploid or normal, we recommend 1 embryo, and that doesn't matter how old you are. Once you are above 35, I don't have the guidelines right in front of me, but it's kind of stepwise. There's a category of 35 to 37, and then it breaks it down by the quality of the embryo and the stage that it was frozen. And we can kind of look across and see, oh, it says you can do 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. If you are, 43, you might be allowed to even do 4. So those are the guidelines that we use. We have a nice little chart to help us figure that out. I'm not really sure what this question is, but it's about mosaic and abnormal embryos. We do allow patients to transfer mosaic or abnormal embryos if you want to. Dr. Kiltz believes that they are your embryos and you have the right to transfer them. We do recommend that you have a consultation with one of the genetic counselors at Cooper Genomics where the PGT testing is done, and they can look at exactly which chromosomes are affected, and then they can tell you what the implications might be from that. So we get a lot of questions. I see one here about specific abnormalities, like what about chromosome 15? What about chromosome 3? We can't really advise you on that because we're not geneticists. We don't have all the literature in front of us, but your genetic counselor will research. They have a whole encyclopedia of information available to them, and they can give you personalized information about what that embryo could result in with each abnormality. Sorry, I'm getting a little winded. Okay, this is a fun question. How long does it take the embryo to fully thaw before transfer? Sometimes the photos you see, they're compacted. Okay, so we do take photos of our embryos right after the embryo thaw, and we actually want to see that the embryos are compacted at that point if they're blastocyst embryos, because we, like I was saying before, we want all of that fluid out of the embryo when we freeze it or vitrify it, because we're not actually freezing. We're vitrifying and warming instead of freezing and thawing, but we all just call it freezing and thawing. So when we thaw the embryos and they come out and they're really compacted, that's totally fine. We can still see if they've survived or not. It's very clear to us under the microscope if the embryo has survived. We do all of our embryo transfers in the morning, probably before 11 a.m. And then the transfers take place throughout the day. So we don't typically take another photo of the embryo right before transfer. So the picture that you're going to get in your portal and that you get at the time from your day of transfer is likely to be the embryo compacted. We do see under the microscope when it's fully expanded, but we don't have a specific time frame where it's like, oh, it's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Because we have transfers, 7:30, 8:30, 9:30, 10:30, 11:30. We're going all through the day. We definitely check the embryo right before transfer, make sure it's still alive, make sure it's nothing weird has happened, which they typically don't change that too much before transfer. So I can understand that you kind of want to know. You can ask your embryologist if you do talk to us, and we can tell you what we saw under the microscope, but the pictures we take are going to be right after the thaw. Okay. Do we ever keep embryos beyond day 7? Recent news of a live birth from day 8. That would be interesting. I didn't see that news of a day 8 embryo having success, but no, for now in the US, in IVF clinics, we only keep embryos until day 7. Our culture system really isn't set up to care for them after day 7, and most embryos will just start degenerating. I think in the research world, they can keep them longer, but that hasn't translated to clinical outcomes yet. but I will definitely look that up. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. Okay, so I see a question about the embryo catheter and embryos getting stuck in the catheter. I did bring some props today for you guys, so I can show you the catheter and our embryo transfer dish just so you see what we're doing while you are waiting for us. Because I'm going off script. That's okay. All right, so when you're doing your embryo transfer, there's a lot of double checks to the ID process. So when we thaw the embryo, we have 2 embryologists checking the cryolock, which again is this little device where the embryos are. So we're comparing the name, date of birth, everything to make sure which embryo we're thawing. We have 2 embryologists doing that. And then at the time of transfer, your embryo transfer dish, which this is where your embryo is living for a few hours. This has your name on it, and then your incubator spot has your name, date of birth, your partner's name, date of birth, your unique ID. So at time of transfer, we're verifying the dish versus the incubator, which is traced back to your cryolock, to your worksheet, and the doctor and the nurse and the embryologist are all verifying your identity right before the time of transfer. So once the doctor or the nurse tells us that they are ready for us to load the embryo, I'll show you what we have. So this is a catheter here. This is actually, it's not this big. So this is our outer protective layer. So the end of the catheter where we load the embryo is quite flexible. And this a little bit stiffer part is what passes through the cervix. And we are actually giving the doctor just this inside part. So he's doing that trial embryo catheter. So he's putting this stiffer part in, and then we come in with this, which they sometimes call the noodle. I don't know. There's not really a great name for it. And that's what we're threading into the outer catheter. So when the nurse tells us that we're ready to load the embryo, we have a big syringe. And in your transfer dish, it's going to be this well here. We have media that's safe for the embryo that we suck up and to rinse the catheter. So we're rinsing the catheter so it's all clean and ready to go. And then we have our smaller syringe, which helps us monitor how much fluid we're loading the embryo with, because we want a very specific amount. And in another well, see, we already did this one. This is going to have embryo glue. We use embryo glue for all of our transfers. That's our standard protocol now. This well is going to have a few little drops that we rinsed the embryo through right after we thawed it. And then this is where your embryo is going to live for a few hours. So we're going to take the embryo glue, put a little bit in here, move your embryo into this well, and then we're going to load a little bit of embryo glue. Let me see. A little bit of embryo glue, then the embryo, and then a little bit more embryo glue. So the embryo is right in the middle of all that fluid. And then we take it out carefully. We come into the room, we say, Jane Doe, 1 embryo. We pass it carefully to the doctor, and he threads it through. And then they love to have you look at the screen, and they say, here we go, poof, and they eject the embryo. So then we take this catheter back. We're going to take this syringe off, fill it up with embryo glue, and then plunge it through the catheter under the microscope. And we check all of that fluid to make sure that the embryo has not been retained. So I don't know if that was interesting to you, but those are my props for the day. All right, so that is the embryo transfer. If you didn't want embryo glue for some reason, you would have to let us know ahead of time, and we would plan to just use our regular culture media, but it is Dr. Kiltz's protocol now to use embryo glue for everyone. So this question was about that you didn't hear from the embryologist that the catheter was clear, but we do, the nurse opens the door and we make eye contact and we say all clear. So that happens every single time. And if we saw an embryo, we would immediately open the door, let you guys know so that we could reload the embryo. So we do check the catheter after every transfer. Oh, thank you, Renee. I'm glad somebody liked it. Okay. So when you come for your embryo transfer, you're going to check in with the Healing Arts staff. Well, I guess it's not technically Healing Arts over here anymore because we moved the spa across the street, but we still call it Healing Arts. So you're going to check in at the back of the building. If you're having acupuncture, pre-transfer or post-transfer, they get you set up for that. You're going to have a little blood work taken. If you're doing a fresh embryo transfer, so you had your retrieval that week, and we've been growing the embryos in the lab for you, an embryologist is going to come in and discuss what we have that day. So it might be day 3, it might be day 5, and we'll show you photos of the embryos. We'll explain which ones are growing, and we'll help you decide how many embryos to transfer. And we'll discuss if any of the other embryos are going to be frozen that day. So if it's a day 3 transfer, typically we'll freeze the embryos on day 3. If you have a lot of embryos and you're doing a day 3 transfer, we can hold the rest of them out to the blastocyst stage and freeze whatever develops properly. If you're having a blastocyst transfer, day 5, day 6, same thing. We'll show you the embryos, we'll pick out what to transfer, and we'll let you know if there are any that can be frozen that day. If it's day 5, a lot of times we'll hold embryos to day 6 if they haven't made it to blast yet. And you'll get a report in your portal once we're done, which is day 6 or day 7. You'll get a report in your portal letting you know how many were frozen and the grades of what was frozen. And then you'll also get all of your pictures in your portal. So we are a very busy lab, as you can see when you come visit us. So most of our communication from the embryology team is going to be through that portal. If you do have any questions about your pictures or your embryo grades or any of your reports, definitely send us a message. We're happy to go over anything with you. Is the embryo glue used at all CNY offices? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't know why I read that question, but I'm not sure. I think so. Let's see if I have anything else about embryo transfers before I move on. I think that's pretty much it for embryo transfers. Okay. Do we do genetic testing for specific genes? Yes, we do. So that's going to be part of the PGT testing. So if you know that you're a carrier for a specific gene disorder or a balanced translocation, that's something that you will consult with Cooper Genomics about. They're going to do all their testing, figure out what they need to be looking for. And then when we do the embryo biopsy, it's just, we still do the same biopsy. Our paperwork's just a little bit different for them. And the test that they do at Cooper is a little bit different. But yeah, so there's PGTA, which tests just for your general, the correct number of chromosomes. They're looking for normal, abnormal, mosaic. PGTM, which is going to be single gene disorders, and then PGTSR, which is balanced translocation. So you can look at Cooper Genomics on their website. They have tons of information about those 3 different categories. You know, whether it's Huntington's or the breast cancer gene or a balanced translocation. Stephanie, yeah, the retrieval rooms are set up for emergencies. I'm not a nurse, so I can't tell you exactly what it is, but they have all the stuff that they need to do. It's just like any other OR with the anesthesiologist and the oxygen and all that good stuff. So yes, they are set up for emergencies. Lauren has a question about deciding between a day 3 fresh transfer or freeze. You can decide once you see how many embryos you have. if you're going to do a fresh transfer, the only thing you might run into is you're talking about duostim. So I don't know enough about the duostim protocols as to when you need to start stimming again. And if you were planning to do a fresh transfer, you would be taking your progesterone after your retrieval to prepare you for that fresh transfer. So then if you decided you didn't want to transfer, I'm not really sure. That would be a question for your nursing team. Is there value in keeping abnormal embryos frozen? It really depends on the patients. For some patients, if all you end up with is abnormal embryos and this is your last shot at IVF, you may decide to transfer your abnormal embryos. Again, we recommend that you speak to a genetic counselor at Cooper Genomics so they can tell you exactly what those chromosomal abnormalities may mean. I'm just scrolling here for a minute. Okay. So how long is an IVF cycle from meds to retrieval and transfer? So it depends on how long you need to take your stim medications. So when you start, you're going to call the nurse with day one of your period and set up your monitoring appointments, and they are going to be giving you medication. You're taking medication at home, and they're tracking your follicles and your blood work. And then I would say it's about average 10 days of stimulation, but that varies widely. At which point they'll give you what we call a trigger shot, which sets you up for the egg retrieval. So that's getting those follicles to mature those eggs and get ready for ovulation. And then the timing of the retrieval is right before ovulation would take place, so that we're hoping to get as many mature eggs as we can. And then your retrieval day is considered day 0 for us in the lab. And then we check for fertilization on day 1, and then your transfer would take place on day 3 or day 5. So an IVF cycle, 15 to 20 days. The grading process, I'm going to do another video next time maybe next time, I'll do it again, with photos and all the grading information. But we have 2 different grading systems. So if we're freezing on day 3, we grade using numbers, and if we freeze on days 5 or 6 or 7, which is the blastocyst stage, we're going to grade with letters. So your numbers on day 3 are 1, 2, 3, or 4. 3 and 4 are considered good, 2 means fair, and 1 means poor. And then you're going to have a second number, which ideally is between 6 and 8, 8 being perfect. So if you had, for example, your grade was we have a slash, so 2/8, that's a fair embryo with 8 cells. If you had a 3/6, it's a good embryo with 6 cells. So if you have day 3 embryos, you're going to see numbers. If you have blastocyst embryos, you're going to see letters, A, B, or C. So A is good, B is fair, and C is poor. And then there's a number on day 5 too, but it would be a 3AA or a 4AA, so 1, 2, 3, 4 again, but that's not actually a good, fair, poor scale. That's just the level of expansion of the embryo. So that's why it'd be good if I had photos for you, maybe next time. So we're judging how expanded the embryo is, 1 being really no expansion, 2 is an early blastocyst, 3 is an expanded blastocyst, and 4 is like very expanded blastocyst, almost hatching. And then we do have 5 and 6, which are hatching and fully hatched. So that's a lot of information, but if you have blastocyst embryos, I would pay attention to the A, B, and C, A being the best. And then how many embryos are typically transferred? It depends mostly on your age and a little bit on the embryo quality. If it's your first transfer and you're under 35, we recommend one embryo. Actually, it might be 37. If you're under 37, one embryo. And then as you get a little bit older, we're comfortable with transferring more than one embryo, but it mostly is based on your age. So can immature eggs be injected with sperm and fertilized? No. So in our lab, we only inject mature eggs. It's a complicated process, but if the eggs aren't mature, they're not ready. They're not ready for a sperm, and the DNA is not going to divide properly or fuse properly. So we will hold the eggs overnight, and if they mature the next day, and your mature eggs didn't fertilize for some reason, and then you had eggs that matured overnight, we can sometimes try to inject those eggs if they look good, which I think another patient mentioned they had a day late of fertilization. That might have been the case there, but that's kind of rare. So Mackenzie has a question about implantation. I don't want to say the right answer or the wrong answer because I would have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's like day 8 to 10. So if you transferred a blast, it would be a few days before it actually implants. Can gender be tested on frozen embryos? I did talk about that. You can thaw and biopsy your embryos. It can be a little stressful for the embryo, and we prefer it if your embryo was already a good grade before we attempt that process. I might do a few more questions. If you have a frozen tessie, do you still try to get a fresh sample and fertilize with both? That depends, Sarah. So if you have frozen sperm, either PESA or tessie, it really depends on the quality of the first sample. If it's a really good sample and we're very confident that we will find sperm when we thaw the sample, we're okay using that sample. We do generally say fresh is best. And we typically use the frozen as a backup situation, but there's definitely times when people, can't travel across the country to provide us a fresh sample. Okay, so I hope this was fun for you guys. If you have any topics that you would like me to touch on in a future video, I'm going to be doing these monthly. So I think I'm going to stick to this time. So it's the second Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m. And I think I want to talk about ICSI next time, and I'm going to try to have a video for you and photos. So I think that'll be next month's topic, but as always, I can take these questions on the side, and if you have any suggestions for topics, feel free to leave them here, and I'll check the comments later. Okay, so thank you so much for tuning in and for all your questions. That was fun. All right, bye.